So the past 24 hours have left the entire world a little shell-shocked. Events have transpired so quickly, and the circumstances in Afghanistan have changed so drastically that many of the academics, the politicians, and even the policymakers have been left a little dumbfounded. The US withdrawal, the exit of Ashraf Ghani, which has been criticized by many people from his own government, and has left a sort of power vacuum and a very tenuous situation. There has been a lot of criticism regarding the way that the US withdrew, including the deals that they had made with the Taliban, effectively giving them international legitimacy. It remains to be seen what the future of Afghanistan will look like, what the government structure or the makeup will look like. Will that government be provided international recognition? What sort of rulers will the Taliban shape up to be? Since their spokespersons have given assurances that the rule will be peaceful, just, and the rights of all citizens will be provided within the boundaries of Islamic law. But I think we can all agree that what happens in Afghanistan over the next few days, weeks, or even months will shape the future of this region, and it can arguably shape the perceptions of the US for the rest of the world. Today, we have a very prominent personality with us, Mr. Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution, who will be discussing post-withdrawal Afghanistan. We hope to learn from his expertise and knowledge and look forward to an engaging discussion. Before we begin, Mr. O'Hanlon is going to talk for 20 minutes, and after which, please leave your questions in the chat box so that we can present those to him, because they're only going to be 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. I'm just going to give a very brief background of Mr. O'Hanlon and his credentials. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in US defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He co-directs the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, the Defense Industrial Base Working Group, and the Africa Security Initiative within the Foreign Policy Program. He is an adjunct professor at Columbia and Georgetown Universities, a professional lecturer at George Washington University, and a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He has written many books as well as several hundred op-eds in newspapers. His articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, National Interest, Washington Quarterly, Joint Forces Quarterly, and International Security, among other publications. And in 2021, he was named as one of Washington's most influential people in national security and defense. So Mr. O'Hanlon, over to you.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for the very kind introduction and the excellent summary of where we stand at this momentous week in South Asian history and in the broader American foreign policy towards what we think of as the broader Middle East, South Asia region, and certainly for Biden administration foreign policy and its perception around the world. And I'm not waking up today in a very happy mood. I'm sure many of you, I think Zunaira, you used the word shell-shocked, which is an excellent encapsulation of, I'm sure, where a lot of us are today. I'm also quite unhappy. And frankly, I'm going to start by saying where I'm unhappy with both the United States and with Pakistan, because I think that could set up a lively conversation and hopefully get us reflecting on how we can rebuild our own relationship between our two countries as we figure out how to move forward. Because in a way, what we've seen now is the logical culmination of the broken US-Pakistani relationship. And I don't want to say it was inevitable that we would have a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. I think the Biden administration did make a big mistake in both deciding to leave and then in leaving so fast. And I'll come back to that. But I think that nonetheless, in many ways, where we are today is a function of the inability of Islamabad and Washington to truly cooperate and to fully appreciate each other's strategic interests. And so before getting back to this recent Biden decision, where I'll finish my brief remarks, and maybe Zunaira, I'll try to go a little shorter than 20 minutes so we have a little more time for discussion. But before winding up at that point, I think what I would like to do is give a big picture historical perspective on what I would say is the one big mistake historically that we made towards South Asia and specifically Pakistan, and the one big mistake that you made you collectively, Pakistanis or Pakistani government, towards us. And I think that would hopefully create a little bit of a balance. As you'll see, I'm not going to be particularly kind towards anybody's foreign policy. But I think I'm being honest. And I think that recognizing where we are is going to be necessary for figuring out how to move forward. Let me begin, before I get to the main American mistake, by saying that I do not think the United States fundamentally betrayed Pakistan during the wars between Pakistan and India. I don't think those were our fault. I don't think we were under an obligation to come to your support, because it wasn't really a conflict that was necessary, and it was partly provoked by Pakistan, the series of conflicts. And so I don't think America signs treaties, defensive treaties, in order to allow other countries to pursue their own ambitions. I understand the history of the Kashmir question and why that is fraught, and I certainly understand the Pakistani perspective. And personally, I would like to see the issue resolved by stabilizing and formalizing the situation along the line of control, more or less. But the fact that Pakistan chose to use offensive military force to try to take back Kashmir is not our responsibility, not our choice, and therefore not our obligation to support. And therefore, the Indo-Pakistani wars are not, for me, an example of American betrayal of Pakistan. I know many of you will disagree, and we can certainly come back to that. But I do believe that we betrayed you and left you with the enormous challenge of how to stabilize Afghanistan and South Asia after we worked together to defeat the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. So starting with the December 1979 Soviet invasion, all the way through the 1980s, US-Pakistani collaboration with some help perhaps from the Emiratis, maybe from the Saudis, was outstanding. And frankly, you helped us win the Cold War, because it was the defeat of the Mujahideen that, whether or not it was good for Afghanistan, and I think the jury is still out on that question, it certainly was good for American global strategic interests, at least in that short to medium term time horizon, because it ultimately cast the death bell for the Soviet Empire. The failure of the Soviet Union to stabilize Afghanistan, the suffering of Soviet forces, the huge cost in blood and treasure for Moscow, combined with the increasingly undeniable economic inefficiencies of the Soviet state, are really what ended the Cold War. And by bringing Gorbachev to power in the first place, and then by ultimately persuading him and others that a radical change was needed, much more radical than just pulling Soviet forces out of Afghanistan, but actually giving up the fight, giving up the Cold War, and ultimately giving up the Warsaw Pact, and even giving up the Soviet Union. So we owe you an enormous debt of gratitude at a strategic level, at a human level. And of course, all through the 1990s, you and Pakistan bore the brunt of what followed, especially the refugee flows, and especially the uncertainty about what kind of Afghanistan would be on your border in the future. I'm not trying to indulge every Pakistani position on this issue, and I've been to many conferences in Doha, Islamabad, Washington, where I've heard Pakistani friends talk about the need for strategic depth against India. I do not agree with this argument. I do not think that you could fundamentally, in a major strategic way, be jeopardized by anything India would do in Afghanistan. I know there have been allegations of Indian support for certain insurgent groups in Western Pakistan, and it's certainly important to take those allegations seriously, but I don't think they amount to a threat to the Pakistani state writ large. And most of what I know about India's role in Afghanistan is much more benign and much less threatening. So I do not support the Pakistani interpretation of the need for strategic depth against India. However, I do accept and acknowledge that we left you with a very difficult problem, essentially a failed state of, back then, 20 million, some people, just to your immediate north and west, a country with which you share a very long border and some major demographic groups, especially among the Pashtun. And, we didn't help much with that. In fact, we famously said that we didn't really have an interest anymore in that part of the world once the Soviets were defeated. And we somehow assumed that you could mop up whatever residue of a problem might still exist. This was unconscionable on our part. It's not the way that friends or partners should treat friends. And it also was stupid on our part strategically, because it failed to recognize that even if one problem in South Asia was solved, the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, other problems could continue, notably Pakistan's state weakness and the difficult relations between the military and civilian rule, the difficult effort to build a prosperous Pakistani state that could perhaps be stable, that would not be vulnerable to extremist violence, that would not be inclined to potentially seek violent confrontation again with India as a distraction from domestic problems. We had an interest strategically, as well as in humanitarian terms, in helping you do well in the 1990s with your own country. And we did not contribute. Of course, at that point, perhaps the writing was already on the wall that we would have a tough period with the Pakistani and Indian nuclear programs reaching a culmination, and the inevitability of some degree of American distancing from Pakistan and India once the nuclear tests occurred in the late 1990s. So maybe there was no way to have a perfect friendship in that time period, but there certainly was a way to be a lot more supportive of what you were dealing with than we were willing to do. So a big fault for the United States. And it began with, ironically, with probably the best foreign policy president and best foreign policy team of my adult life, the first Bush administration, which did such a good job with Operation Desert Storm and did such a good job with the reunification of Germany, the relationship with Gorbachev. And on balance, it's sort of mind-boggling why and how that team would do such a poor job in collaborating with Pakistan. And you then faced a decade essentially on your own of dealing with a violence-ridden, chaotic, and then extremist Afghanistan. And during that time, you understandably chose to build up a relationship with the Taliban that for you was maybe the least bad option available. I know Pakistanis still debate whether that was a good decision because, of course, it may have carried over into the development of the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, since we know these kinds of extremist groups are never completely separate from each other and do share some membership, share some strategy, share ideas and interests. And so I realized that Pakistanis themselves have some doubts as to whether it was ever smart to forge this relationship with the Afghan Taliban. But as an American who now watches this from a distance and with an historical perspective, I cannot really blame you for that period of time and your decision to affiliate and support the Afghan Taliban because you didn't really have any good choices. And even this extremist group that really wanted to govern Afghanistan back then as if we were still in the 8th century, that group was for you preferable to the chaos that followed the warlord period of the first half of the 1990s, when you had 6 or 7 different militias taking turns shelling Kabul and preventing any kind of governance, any kind of decent human existence for the people of Afghanistan. And as bad as the Taliban were once they took power, I doubt very much that life was any worse under their rule for the typical Afghan than it had been in the first half of the 1990s. So up until that point, up until 9/11, I don't really have any major objection to Pakistani foreign policy, leave aside the nuclear issue for now. And I have a lot of criticism for my own countries. But now let's look at the last 20 years. And, we came in, we overthrew the Taliban, and we had some international support for that, and ultimately UN blessing And we really were within our rights under the UN Charter because the Taliban had aided and abetted the Al-Qaeda network that attacked us on 9/11. And so we had every right to overthrow the Taliban. But then from the point of view of Pakistan, you watched us minimize our commitment to stabilize Afghanistan thereafter. And those first few years, I think we missed an opportunity to put in sort of a medium footprint, a medium level of effort. We tried to keep our effort minimal, partly because the United States was distracted by Iraq. Our European allies didn't really have the capacity or at least the willingness to do a whole lot on their own. They did a pretty poor job of building up the initial Afghan police and army. We left them primarily on that side of things in charge of those efforts. We continued the counterterrorism fight, but it wasn't until about 2007 or 8 that we really got serious about Afghanistan and about trying to build a state that could stay on its own feet and therefore prevent the further development of extremist networks or sanctuaries on its own soil. But that's where I begin to become critical of Pakistan. I understand that you could not be expected to immediately shift your thinking or immediately assume that because we were now devoting more resources to South Asia, that you could count on us to do a good job. I understand the argument for skepticism, but we really started to put in a lot of resources starting around 2007, accelerating into 2008, accelerating much more under President Obama. And even though we announced the big increase in troops in the same speech on December 1st, 2009, where Obama also announced the inevitable reduction, and so it was really a sharp spike up and down. Even once we came down, all could see that we were going to devote more resources to Afghanistan than we had previously. Obama had been emphasizing this in his campaign speech. Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, was emphasizing this even when he was still part of the Bush administration. That continued into the Obama administration. And so in the period of 07, 08, 09, 010, I really think that Pakistanis should have been taking greater note of just how much US policy had fundamentally committed itself to trying to stabilize Afghanistan. It's in this period of time when I think Pakistan made its big mistake. And essentially, the ISI chose to retain the same kind of linkages to the Afghan Taliban that it had before, and to tolerate the same kind of sanctuary, the unmolested use of planning cells in Quetta and Peshawar, the so-called Quetta and Peshawar Shuras, remained intact. And sorry, somebody's having a little bit of a microphone question or issue. I'll wait until that's resolved for a second. Okay, so in that 2007 to 2010, 2011 period, I believe we were consistently committed enough to not only Afghanistan, but even to Pakistan with much greater economic support that I think there should have been more of a fundamental reassessment. And it should have been apparent that with President Obama making Afghanistan his top foreign policy priority for his first term, that the United States was no longer treating this as a secondary or tertiary theater or interest. But Pakistan chose to keep the Taliban going. It's in that period of time when you really could have denied the Shuras access to the kind of safe havens that they enjoyed. You could have worked harder to deny them access to the kind of materials they used to build improvised explosive devices. You could have put a lot more pressure on them to negotiate or to try to turn into a political party, and you didn't. And I'm sure some of you will have rebuttals to my critique or counter explanations, and that's fine. And I look forward to that in just a few minutes. But my interpretation is that was the period of time when we really had an opportunity to build a new US-Pakistan relationship, a real strategic partnership, probably a more powerful and meaningful one than we had even had in the years when we were formally treaty allies under the CENTO and SATO treaties in your early years of existence as an independent nation. I think we were poised to have a truly productive strategic partnership. And I think Pakistan at that point bears the primary responsibility for deciding not to do that. Now, when I say Pakistan, I understand that's a sweeping statement and it puts everything into one single word as if there were consensus or agreement. And I really understand what I'm really saying is it's the ISI that chose, and the security forces more generally, that chose to maintain the Taliban as essentially what was considered a backup plan. But you know what? By making it your backup plan, you've now made it plan A, because we lost the opportunity to defeat the Taliban when we could have been doing so working together, or at least not defeat them as a movement, but defeat them as a military power and constrain them as a military power, prevent them from essentially waging a high-end insurgency that ultimately defeated our admittedly mediocre efforts, are not particularly sophisticated or consistent efforts to build up a new Afghan state. But I think you have to acknowledge that we tried pretty hard. We pumped a lot of resources into this effort. And yet Pakistanis still didn't really take seriously the idea that we were working to build a new and viable Afghan state, and continued to not only tolerate, but actually actively support the Taliban, even as you were also letting us use your territory to ship supplies to Afghanistan. And of course, we all know the Raymond Davis issue. We all know the Osama bin Laden raid, further complicated matters. And then, of course, we had border incidents, skirmishes, losses of life on both sides that further added tension and toxicity. But the fundamental decision was the decision by Pakistan to stay on friendly terms with the Taliban and allow them to continue to use your territory as sanctuary for planning and even for some degree of providing supplies to their own forces on Afghan soil. And that's where we lost the opportunity to build a new and stable Afghanistan. Again, we weren't very good at our strategy. We weren't very consistent. We had 40 some countries. We changed commanders every year. We pumped too many dollars into Afghanistan and reinforced the corruption problem. We made a million mistakes, but it was not for lack of priority or effort. And yet, I think Pakistan continued to play a double game. So as you can see, I'm not really a fan of either country's foreign policy towards the Afghanistan problem, either your country or mine. And I don't even prioritize which of these two big mistakes was worse. I think they were both huge. They were both huge mistakes, and they have produced the outcome that we see today, Taliban in control of Afghanistan. So I'm going to wrap up, but my point is, President Biden didn't need to pull out. I'm not blaming you for that so much. I mean, his frustrations and his fatigue with this issue were a result partly of our inability to contain the Taliban. And that was partly because Pakistan supported them. But still, Biden had the choice of keeping 3,000 US troops, relatively modest effort, modest cost, modest risk. And he made a mistake. He chose not to do that. And then he chose to pull out fast, which dramatically compounded the problem. So as a result of our collective mistakes, we are where we are. And the Taliban are in charge of Afghanistan. So now our only hope is basically a twofold strategy, as I see it. And I hope that you'll react and give me your thoughts on, of course, as well. But from an American perspective, the twofold strategy is make sure the Taliban understand if they actively support international terrorism, we will strike them and strike them hard in ways that debilitate and punish. I don't know what those ways will yet be, but we will certainly use our self-defense prerogative to do that if we need to. But at the same time, we should try to give the Taliban incentives to moderate their behavior and their ideology, to do what they claim they're planning to do, protect all Afghan citizens within the confines and parameters of Islamic law, just as you said a few minutes ago, Zunaira, with respect for non-Sunni Muslims, with respect for Shia, with respect for Christians, and also obviously with respect for women, and with some kind of a fair system of justice, even if it may have more of a Sharia element than we in the West would advocate or prefer ourselves. So I think we have to try to give them some incentives, and we have to hold out the possibility of some degree of diplomatic recognition and humanitarian assistance if they behave in the better ways that they claim they might. And that's now our common challenge. So I'll stop there. I'll just make those simple short points to set up a discussion about where future policy should go. but I really felt in my opening remarks I needed to get to the history so that we can hopefully all approach this with a certain amount of humility and recognition that we've let each other down. But now we have no choice but to try to work together on the path ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. So we have Dr. Samina Yasmeen with us, who is currently at the University of Western Australia in Perth. She has a question for you, so I'm just going to give her the floor.
Thank you very much, Sunera, and thank you very much, Professor O'Hanlon. I enjoyed listening to your presentation. Before I ask the question, if I could just say something, I think when we're looking at what's happening in Afghanistan, it's not just simply a question of Pakistan and America and what's happened, it's you or us. It's a regional development with huge significant international implications. So I think it's important that that's how we look at it and go beyond pinpointing whose fault it is. But in that process, what I would like to suggest is that it's probably time to go beyond just simply saying, well, we left too quickly or Pakistan supported Taliban, Afghan Taliban, to understanding how narratives start evolving in different places. So you can't separate the evolution of an anti-Pakistan narrative in Afghanistan and anti-Afghan stroke Indian nexus in Pakistan that actually kept on perpetuating the misperception. So I would like your opinion on that. And secondly, what I'd like is your view on where do you see the role of countries like Turkey? And how do you see Iran in this whole picture? Because again, as I said, we need to get away from just Pakistan, US, you're good, I'm bad, so-and-so is worse, to saying, how do we deal with it?
Thank you, Samina. Well, I did get away, I think, from saying you're bad or I'm worse or you're worse. I mean, I came out with an argument that both sides have made big mistakes. And I do think we are the two most important foreign powers in Afghanistan, or at least we have been for the last 20 to 30 years. You will probably continue to be. We'll see about our role. I also think that that the narratives need to be challenged with an honest assessment of the history. So you said we have to think about how the narratives develop. I think they often develop because each side is self-righteous. Each side is very good at giving one half of the talk I just gave, the half that serves its own national interests. And so I'm hoping that on both sides of this debate, we can start to hear more Americans and more Pakistanis willing to wrestle with the mistakes their own country has made, even in a sort of empathetic context of understanding why the mistakes were made, and made out of cruelty or fundamental desires to hurt the other side for the sake of punishment. Or I think that we have to develop a more historical understanding that even if, for example, we Americans don't usually think that you need to think of Afghanistan as an area that you require strategic depth in, but that is in fact a Pakistani argument. And it's one that many of you believe. And so if we don't wrestle with it, we can't put ourselves in your shoes and think about a path forward. If we don't remember the history of the 1990s, and I try to talk about it a lot because a lot of people forget it. I don't think too many Pakistanis forget it, but a lot of Americans forget it. And that's why I begin this kind of a talk. I actually gave one other talk to a Pakistani think tank this summer. And I began with the same order, the same chronology, because as an American, I think it's important to begin, set the right tone by saying where I think my country got it wrong. So I did that first. But that's the only way I know how to challenge narratives that perpetuate mistaken policies in both countries. To go back and look at the history honestly and fairly, and sometimes make an extra effort as an American, speaking just for myself in this case, to begin with an acknowledgement of the mistakes my own country has made. And remarkably, this was the best foreign policy team we probably have ever had in the United States, at least in the post-World War II era. It was Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft and George Bush and Dick Cheney as Secretary of Defense. And I think he was a better Secretary of Defense than he was a Vice President. And that overall team, Bob Gates was CIA director. And that was a pretty impressive team, and they still got it wrong. So by way of historical, by the way of countering the narrative, I do want to spend a little bit of time challenging my own country's past policies. But if I leave it at that, in a democracy like mine or like yours, if you only criticize your own country, first of all, you leave half the history out. And second, you erode your own credibility with your own countrymen. So I don't expect any Pakistani to just get up and blame his or her own country. I think it's only fair that we acknowledge where we feel slighted or misappreciated or understood by the other side. So that's all I can tell you. That's why I took the approach I did. And that's what I'm going to try to continue to do in my future speaking and writing about this relationship.
Sorry, Janera, with your permission, could I just follow up a little bit more?
Sure, we just we have to also...
very quick. Yeah.
Okay.
I would just say, Michael, I understand where you're coming from, but as someone who's lived in Australia for 40 years plus, it's not a question of your country, my country. It's a question of what went wrong. And I guess one thing that you may wish to reflect on, not now, but later on, to see to what extent did American presence fail to construct another narrative that could have helped Pakistan and Afghanistan to come together, but it didn't. But now we really have to look at and say, what role can we expect America, Pakistan, and other countries to make sure that we do create a positive environment in which Taliban are controlled, but at the same time, no one is engaged in blame game. I think we need to go beyond that, but that's where I'll stop my interjection because I think others are waiting.
Well, you may be right that, maybe I spent too much time on the history. Maybe we're all ready for a fresh start. Although I doubt whether fresh starts really happen while people still bear historical grudges. So I tend to think you got to keep weaving the history into the present policy discussion. I also think, and I know for a fact, because I was part of this in an advisory capacity, in an informal advisory capacity to the US government, that in the era of 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, this is Petraeus, McChrystal, or in reverse order, John Allen, Joe Dunford, all four of them are good friends of mine. One of them is my boss at the moment, but all four of those commanders of the International Security Assistance Force spent a lot of time in Pakistan, as did the heads of the Central Command, but also chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen, General Dempsey. And there was an effort to view this region in ways that Pakistanis often found offensive because you didn't like the hyphen. But we tried to think of a narrative that could make Afghanistan and Pakistan feel like they were collaborative neighbors and that we were working to do our part to promote that. So I do think in that period of time, we tried, which again is to me the period of time when the Pakistanis could have done better. That's the main period where I wish the Pakistanis had taken a different approach. The main period where I think we could have taken a different approach is the 1990s.
Thank you. So I think the second part of Dr. Yasmeen's question was kind of ignored in that, where we were talking about the role of Turkey and other countries. But I think you can just tie that up with another question because I see a bunch of raised hands. So Imran Sardar has a question. He's a research analyst at IRS.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful insight. I just wanted to know what kind of immediate measures that United States is looking for in Afghanistan. Especially, I want to know the future of counterterrorism strategy. And secondly, what kind of strategic partner that you have mentioned we can expect in Pak-US relations, since Pakistan is already in a strategic partnership with China. So how is it going to impact the future Pak relations? United States relations.
Thank you, Imran, and thanks for the kind words. And let me also say briefly, Samina, without getting into Turkey and Iran in detail, I don't think they're nearly as important as Pakistan in terms of the history or the future of where Afghanistan goes. They are important, clearly, but overall, where we are today has more to do with US and Pakistani policy than Iranian or Turkish policy, in my judgment. So that's just my brief comment in passing. In terms of counterterrorism strategy in Afghanistan going forward, well, of course, we're waking up today to a brand new world, right? And so part of the answer has to be, we don't know yet. We're just starting to think about it. And we don't really hope that we'll have to think about it too much because we're hoping the Taliban will live up to their promise, although no one really takes that for granted. So that's part of the answer. Another part, going back to the Afghanistan study group that was convened last year by the U.S. Institute of Peace, that General Dunford and Senator Ayotte and Steve Hadley and others led, and I was part of the work team on that. There was a group, a cell within the Afghanistan study group that advocated for a quick U.S. pullout, and that therefore had to analyze and discuss what the counterterrorism strategy might be in the event that we left. And frankly, I never found their recommendations very compelling, which is part of why I never agreed with their idea and never agreed, therefore, with President Biden's decision to pull out. I don't really think that doing counterterrorism from a distance is an optimal approach, because human networks and human intelligence are so crucial to doing it right. And what you need to have some Americans on the ground, and you need to have Afghans in stable jobs inside the government who are willing at a professional and strategic and personal level to work with and trust the Americans who are there. And we've lost all that now by our departure and now by the collapse of the Afghan government. But I still think that if we're talking about substantial sanctuary, that we are going to be listening very intently with various kinds of satellites and aircraft for signals intelligence. We're going to be using long-range unmanned aerial vehicles operating out of the Persian Gulf, or sometimes off ships in the Indian Ocean with your permission on overflight. And these are the kinds of assets that we will now have to bring to bear to try to figure out what might be happening inside of Afghanistan, and if the Taliban are keeping their word. And frankly, we already know they're not perfectly keeping their word, right? Because the Haqqani network is inside of the Taliban leadership. And the Haqqani network is also part of al-Qaeda. But maybe these ties can weaken. Maybe at least the collaboration at an operational level can be limited or precluded. And we're going to have to watch very carefully. And I hope that's one more reason why I hope we can rebuild our relationship with you. Because obviously, even if we can't be on the ground in Afghanistan, we can work carefully with you in trying to get intelligence on what's happening with any potential al-Qaeda or ISIS developments. Then we'll all be better off. So that's my main answer on the counterterrorism strategy. There might have been one last piece to your question, and I apologize if I haven't covered it.
So the next question is from Aarish Khan. Please you can have the floor now.
Thank you, Zanera. I have two questions basically. One is that you mentioned that Pakistan is important for where Afghanistan is going to go in the future. But I would like you to shed some light on where do you think Afghanistan is headed as things stand. And looking at the past, you talked about all the mistakes that the US government and the government of Pakistan has made in the post-Cold War era and in the post-9/11 era. But I would also like you to shed some light on the mistakes of the US government with regard to its foreign policy on Pakistan, like with regard to its foreign policy with respect to Pakistan. So what if you were to list a few major mistakes of the US government with regard to Pakistan in the post-9/11 period, what would those be? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Although the main subtext of my earlier remarks is that I blame us a lot more for what we did in the 1990s. And I don't think that we made huge mistakes in the 2000s. Sure, you can argue about we didn't have a very good counterinsurgency strategy at first inside of Afghanistan. We should have taken the whole effort to build up an Afghan state more seriously. Perhaps we should have listened to you more about how to bring elements of the Taliban into the new, Karzai government coming out of the Bonn process. Maybe that's the one thing I haven't touched on yet that I should probably at least acknowledge, where Pakistan probably had some leverage and influence with the Taliban, and perhaps we could have taken more benefit of your expertise and your connections. So maybe I'll add that to the list. And then on your first question about where I think Afghanistan is going, there's probably two distinct possibilities. If you had asked me a week ago, I would have said there were three. But I no longer think that widespread civil war is a high probability. There is a chance that the Tajiks will try to consolidate positions in the Panjshir Valley and elsewhere, and then enlarge their territorial holdings compared to what they had in the 1990s. Or maybe if the Taliban's smart, they'll just negotiate an autonomous zone in the Panjshir Valley and let the Tajiks there have what they did in the 1990s and not provoke the Tajiks into trying to launch, essentially a new phase in the civil war. But it looks right now as if there's not going to be a civil war, and we should count our blessings, I suppose, on that front. But still, there is no reason for an overly sanguine or happy prognostication, because the more benign scenario is where the Taliban sort of govern like they said they wanted to, and they try to get along with the rest of the world well enough that they can hold on to the country. And it's no longer a democracy, it's an Islamist theocracy. But, it's a kinder, gentler version of what they had in the 90s, or certainly of what Iran runs now in Shia terms in Iran, in its own country there. And maybe it starts to look like, a sort of a benign autocracy, an Islamist autocracy in this case. And we know the United States can live with benign autocracies. We usually don't say nice things about them. We don't give them a lot of foreign assistance. We don't invite them to state dinners in Washington, but we can tolerate them. And, if Afghanistan becomes forgettable the way that, with apologies to the countries to its north, the way that Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan are more or less forgettable in American foreign policy, and just becomes more or less a country that may not be the most ideal place to live from a Western perspective, but keeps its problems within its own borders and doesn't carry out wide-scale human rights pogroms against its own people, then that's sort of a tolerable path forward. And that's the best case. And of course, the less good case is where the Taliban either commit large-scale human rights abuses or affiliate with international terrorist groups that then attack you or attack us or attack other countries in the region. And then let's hope that we can work together to counter that, make sure the Taliban understand in advance that Pakistan and the United States might work together in that kind of a strategy, and thereby discourage the Taliban from going down that path in the first place. So those are the scenarios that I would sketch out.
Thank you. So Tabinda Siddiqui has her hand raised, so please ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for this informed discussion, Mr. O'Halloran. Thanks for being so blunt and good. You have tried very well to contextualize the current situation in the historic context. I would also like to add something to some events, some facts, and some situations that were not highlighted by you. Like, while listening to your presentation, it felt like you have just summarized the last 20 years literature on Pakistan that was single-handedly targeting Pakistan and blaming Pakistan for every ill in Afghanistan. It seems like, no, I'm sorry, it is going to be a little bit longer question.
No, can we get to the question, because
yes,
we don't really
I
don't
just
have
want
time.
to add some points. It is not really a question, but I just want to add some points that are not highlighted in various discussions, and Pakistan bashing actually takes the top of the discussion. I just want to say, like, what you presented, it seems like Pakistan was running the show in Afghanistan, while this was not the case. United States was running the show in Afghanistan. When it comes to Taliban support, I would just like to add, like, there were many things that were happening in Afghanistan
Sorry. So for everyone else, please, can we keep it to questions and a discussion on the topic that's already been done? We do not have time for debates and a back and forth. So I'm just going to read some questions out from the chat because we only have about 10 minutes to go. Okay, so Mariam Mastoor has a question where she's asking that you are very right that Pakistan is confronted by a huge challenge, and Taliban have now emerged as a invincible power by defeating the US. And with this immense power, Taliban can destabilize their region with their ideology of pan-Islamism. What is your take on that? Second, if you were in Pakistan's place and had stakes in your own country vis-a-vis your decision regarding Taliban, I'm talking about TTP, what would your strategy have been? And thirdly, why do you think the US has failed in establishing democracy in Afghanistan? You can also merge those questions if you feel.
Well, I don't have any major criticism of your strategy towards the TTP. We can all debate, we can all say that things could have been done in any military operation in a more, careful way. But overall, I thought you were pretty effective. And I think we all need to help you build a more prosperous future for your own citizens. And that's a more stable civil military relations. I'm glad to see some trends towards democracy, I think, becoming more effectively entrenched in Pakistan. You've had peaceful transitions of civilian power in recent years. That's a good thing. So I think those are, longer term elements of a counter TTP strategy, which show some promise. So I'll add that hopeful point. And I'm sorry, when 3 questions at a time is probably too many because I wasn't prepared and I wasn't taking notes. So if you don't mind reminding me of the first one really quickly, and then I'll come back to the third one in a second too.
The first one is that Taliban can destabilize the region with their ideology of pan-Islamism. What is your take on that?
Yeah, well, it's going to be a test of what the Taliban really want, right? And some of you may have a better feel for this than I do. I haven't spent a lot of time talking with Taliban in my life. I certainly don't know the leadership that was holed up in Peshawar and Quetta. It does strike me that the leadership in the Peshawar and Quetta shuras of the Afghan Taliban, these were some of the only people in all of South Asia who were safe from terrorism and insurgency in the last 20 years, because they were effectively in a sanctuary situation. You in Pakistan were not safe because you had to deal with the TTP. We in Afghanistan were not safe because we had to deal with the foot soldiers from the Afghan Taliban who were causing great mayhem. But the shuras were relatively safe, which is a huge irony. These are not, as best I can tell, people who really have the stoic purity of some of the early Al-Qaeda leaders. And I don't, of course, like Al-Qaeda, but they did have a very stark, and some of the early Taliban, a very stark, pure vision of what life should be like in a caliphate. And it involved a lot more violence than most of us are comfortable with. It involved far worse treatment of women and minorities than any of us would ever condone. But some of the leaders of those early movements were willing to live in a very austere way. I'm not sure that the Afghan Taliban leadership really wants to live an austere lifestyle, constantly on the run, holed up again in mountains and caves, eluding American or Pakistani airstrikes. So I think there's a chance that they're going to behave themselves because they actually want to run a country. They want to live in they want to have their meetings in the presidential palace where they all showed up yesterday. They want to enjoy some of the nice meals that their negotiating team has been indulging in Doha for the last 2 years. And so, I say this to some extent in a disparaging way, but it's actually something I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that they will at least want a basic modicum of stable modern life, and that will discourage them from wanting to destabilize the region or the world more. Because if they do that, then they're going to be punished. And if there's nothing else that I hope they've learned in the last 20 years, it's that we Americans, and I think you Pakistanis as well, we are not paper tigers. We are willing to take risks in defense of our own country's security interests. Back in the 1990s, we just shot off cruise missiles if we had a problem with somebody. And after Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu in 1993, we simply left because 18 fatalities on one day was more than we would tolerate. And bin Laden noticed that. And he said that he thought we were a paper tiger. Well, I don't believe that the Taliban would view us as a paper tiger any longer. So I think there's a good chance they're going to behave a little better, partly out of fear and partly out of the desire for a better life. At least that has to be that's the best strategy we have to go on, that we should try to induce the Taliban in those kinds of directions, preserving their own necks. And by the way, we're going to have to worry about their revenue from the drug trade, because again, these are not pure, they may say they're Islamist. These are not the most admirable Muslims in the world. I know a lot of Muslims who would never indulge in a drug trade as a way of supporting themselves, even in a time of war. You know, I admire the Muslim friends I have here in the United States. They really take their faith seriously. And I think a lot of us can learn from that. But I'm not sure the Taliban are great Muslims. But we're going to have to see. You know, we're going to have to try to wean them from the drug trade, wean them from violence, wean them from their abuse of minorities. And there is a good chance we can do that, and therefore not have this mayhem spreading throughout South Asia. So that's maybe the best, or at least the most hopeful answer I can give to that part of the question.
Right. So I think we have run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your thoughts, as blunt as they may be. I think that it's true that everyone has their part to play, but you know, obviously there are different opinions on how this specific withdrawal has turned out, and I think that there is you know, there is a heated debate on it, and there's criticism on both sides. So thank you so much for taking the time out, and I think yes.
You want me to try to, I see there's just one more hand left, or maybe there was one more question. If you want, I can try to answer them both really quickly as we wrap. I didn't want to cut off.
Yes, so if you can, the last question would probably be that why do you feel that the US has failed in establishing democracy in Afghanistan? And secondly, do you see the US playing any sort of meaningful role in Afghanistan in the future, in the post-withdrawal future?
On the latter point, I think we'll minimize our role. You know, I hope we try to use the offer of some degree of humanitarian aid, maybe measured in the low hundreds of millions of dollars a year, to try to preserve some of the gains in health and give the Taliban some incentive to avoid the most extreme forms of their behavior. But the days of, you know, pumping several $1 billion a year in aid into South Asia, I think, are over for us. And, you know, the Taliban are not going to be our friends. What I hope is that we can avoid them being our enemies. They're not going to be our friends. And the greater likelihood here is the United States will try to forget about the region like we did in the 90s, which is always a danger. And it's not a great tendency in our view towards Afghanistan in particular, but that's the greater risk. I don't think we're going to want to play a big role. I used to sometimes have a chance to talk with President Karzai, and he was so persuaded that we Americans really wanted to be in Afghanistan because it was somehow strategic in location. And I just said, you know, with all due respect, Mr. President, I study global military operations and interests of the United States, and I just don't think Afghanistan is strategic in location. If we want to do reconnaissance on Russia or China, we're better off focusing on Europe and the Western Pacific regions and using our spy satellites. Afghanistan is not a great place any longer. We used to fly U-2s out of Peshawar, but that's a long time ago, much different era. So anyway, I think we're likely to minimize our role. But as to why we failed in building democracy, and I'll finish on this point, and it gets to my friend who wanted to debate me and that you asked not to do so. But I acknowledge that some of those points were fair. We did not do a good job of state building in Afghanistan. At first, we did too little. Then we rushed in and tried to do too much. And we reinforced corruption along the way because we were in such a hurry that we had to pump dollars wherever we could. And that often meant to the wrong people. We did not build up the judiciary. I think building up an independent court system is one of the most underappreciated elements of trying to promote democracy. And sometimes, even though we Americans should know better, having such an old democracy ourselves, it really is separation of powers, independent judiciary, and protection of individual rights that are at the heart of democracy just as much as elections. And so I think we forgot that in Iraq, where we tried to have all those elections early on in 2004, 2005. And we were, I remember George Bush gave his speeches and he had Iraqis in the audience with their purple finger. They had dipped in the dye to show they had voted. And this was meant to be some great testament and proof that we had achieved democracy in Iraq. But of course, the political parties aligned primarily along sectarian lines. And the elections, therefore, actually made things worse rather than better for a while, because we did not have protection of minority and individual rights, a strong judicial system that was independent, a strong press that was protected and transparent and safe. So, we did not prioritize those things enough. But I think the main problem was this up and down. First too little, then too much. And then, even though Obama tried to stay steady at some level, he kept having these annual reviews every year in which he promised that we might leave quickly. And that fostered a sense of instability in Afghanistan. But the fundamental issue, and this really is my last sentence, is that Afghanistan was broken it was never a strong state to begin with. It was broken by the Soviet invasion. It was broken by the Mujahideen fight that we asked our Afghan friends to carry out on behalf of all of us to defeat the Soviets. And so with starting from a weak base and then having the country essentially attacked and destroyed from within and without for 4 decades, the raw materials for democracy just weren't really very promising. And that's why I would have been patient. I would have said, let's give them more time. We're down to 3,000 US troops. Let's give them 10 more years. It just takes time to build institutions and build human capital. And I wish we had done that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. There were a lot of questions left over, but hopefully we can get you back at some time soon and get those questions answered. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope it was a productive discussion for everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.